Colloquium on the Synopsis Purioris Theologiae. Just wanted to let you know that there is this flyer out here at the little desk that you see there. In the top right-hand corner, in that little blue bubble that you can see, there's an activation code for a 35% discount on the volumes of the Synopsis Purioris Theologiae from Brill. So that's right outside. There's more information that you can look at there. We've got also some information on here about Volume 1, 2, and 3. Volume 1, of course, came out in 2014. Volume 2, we're anticipating that towards the end of this year. And then Volume 3 is scheduled for 2018. So there's a little bit more about that. There's some links on there, and you can get some more information about that just right outside. This morning, we have the privilege of Donald Sinnema, Randy Blacketer, and Mark Beach speaking to us this morning. Dr. Donald Sinnema is Professor of Theology Emeritus at Trinity Christian College. He's also a general editor with Christian Moser and Herman Selderhuis on the Acta, or Documenta Synodi Nationalis and Doordrechtanae. That is being published with Vanden Hoek and Ruprecht. And of course, that's going to be an 8-volume set when it's all done. 9-volume. Okay, well, I've got to update that. 9-volume. And Mark Beach is Professor of Ministerial and Doctrinal Studies at Mid-America Reformed Seminary in Dyer, Indiana. He has taught there for 18 years. Prior to that, he served in the pastorate for 12 years. His PhD is from Calvin Seminary. He is managing editor of the Mid-America Journal of Theology and frequently contributes to that journal as well. Dr. Beach regularly preaches in area churches, and his academic interests are Reformation, post-Reformation studies, contemporary theology, especially surrounding Karl Barth, and aspects of pastoral ministry. And then Dr. Raymond Blacketer is the lead pastor at First Cutlerville CRC, as well as doing adjunct teaching at Hope College and Western Seminary. And so please welcome with me our panel this morning.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be talking about the first edition of William Ames' Medulla as a disputation cycle. Part of the title, which is not up there, is a precursor to the Leiden synopsis, and there should be a question mark behind that. By the way, I'm going to be dealing with the first edition. It so happens that the seminary here has a copy of I think it's the 7th edition, 1641 Medulla. So if you carefully circulate it and look at it, it's probably an interesting specimen. The Leiden synopsis of 1625 was the product of a cycle of disputations presided over by the 4 theologians at Leiden University between 1620 and 1624. A few years ago, Henk Vandenbelt and I published an article about the synopsis as a disputation cycle in the context of earlier and later cycles at Leiden. But it has not been recognized that in the same time frame, in 1622 and 1623, William Ames presided over a similar cycle of disputations at Franeker University and published the cycle as the first edition of his famous Medulla, or Marrow of Theology, in 1623, 2 years before the Leiden synopsis appeared. Both volumes represent the first fruits of Reformed Orthodoxy after the Synod of Dort. This paper will explore the origins of the Medulla, especially the first edition of 1623, as the product of a disputation cycle. This first edition has never been carefully examined, perhaps because copies are extremely rare and its character has been much misunderstood. Ames scholars typically and mistakenly describe the 1623 edition as fragmentary compared to the full edition of 1627. They have habitually focused on the 1627 and later editions of the Medulla, which became the famous textbook. The Medulla went through 4 stages in its composition. First of all, a preliminary unpublished form, perhaps just lecture notes, for private instruction of theology students at the Leiden Staten College between 1619 and 22. Second, separately published disputations for a cycle of public disputations presided over by Ames at Franeker University from June 1622 to December 1623. Third, a volume published by printer Ulricus Balk at Franeker in December 1623 under the title Medulla Sacrae Theologiae, as a collection of all the disputations of the cycle presided by Ames. And four, a revised edition prepared by Ames as a theology textbook in the form of a compendium and published in 1627 by Junius in Amsterdam. Later printings retain the same form with some corrections and slight revisions. So first of all then, the first stage, Ames' private teaching at Leiden. In August 1619, a few months after the close of the Synod of Dort, where he served as theological advisor to President Bogerman, Ames was recommended for appointment to a new chair of practical theology at Leiden University. Though the Leiden curators considered this, King James I of England blocked the appointment because Ames was suspected of having a hand in writing certain books critical of the established Church of England. In the 3 years while in Leiden, 1619 to 22, Ames was only able to earn a livelihood by doing part-time jobs. Now, the only primary evidence of Ames' actual teaching activity at Leiden between 1619 and 22 comes from two sources: Ames himself and Matthew Nathenus, Ames's first biographer. First of all, Ames states in his dedicatory epistle to the Medulla, which first appeared in the revised 1627 edition, quote, "To the pious and benevolent merchants of Amsterdam, who at their expense have liberally provided for the studies of poor youths intending to enter the holy ministry. 7 years ago," that's 1620, "you entrusted to my care some of your students, which was the first occasion of drawing out this marrow or medulla of theology so that it might serve them." Then Ames' first biographer, Matthew Nathenus, added more details in his biographical preface to Ames' opera of 1658. Again, I quote, "After the Synod of Dort was concluded in 1619, when Festus Homius was called to the administration of the Theological College, that's the Staten College, his place in the superintendence and examination, two key words, of those students of theology expecting to enter the holy ministry who were supported at Leiden University by certain Amsterdam merchants, was taken by Mr. Ames, who at the moment stood idle in the marketplace. For the use of these students, he first drew out what he later published, the learned Medulla." Nathenus continued to describe Ames' further development of the Medulla at Franeker. Now, at Franeker, he perfected, by means of small parts of public disputations, small parts I take to be individual disputations, he published what he had drawn out at Leiden for the sake of students who were to be examined by the commissioners, the Medulla Theologiae, economical in words and rich and ample in meaning. Now, what is clear from both Ames and Nathenus is that the origin of the Medulla was in Ames' teaching of poor students at Leiden who were supported by scholarships from Amsterdam merchants. These scholarship students would have been enrolled in the Leiden Staten College, the residence and training center related to the university, for scholarship students preparing for the ministry. And in this role of instruction, Ames was the successor of Festus Homius. Now, what do we know of Homius's role in instructing students at Leiden? I'm going to skip a section here. The point of this section is basically we've just got two quotes about Ames's activity. So what other source of information can we get about what he might have been teaching? We know he succeeded Homius. So what was Homius doing? Basically, in that 10-year period before the Synod of Dort, he was doing three things. He was a minister, and in terms of teaching, he was doing three things. He was teaching homiletics, which wasn't offered at the university. The pastors did the teaching of homiletics. He was teaching a cycle of disputations on the Heidelberg Catechism. And third, he was doing a cycle of disputations on the disputations of Robert Bellarmine, the Catholic controversialist. And he was doing all of this part-time, privately, in his own home. He's not part of the university or the Stoughton College. He's doing this privately at the request of students who are enrolled in the university. And he's doing it for two reasons. He's doing it, first of all, because of short staffing at the college or at the university. In that whole period, there were never the full complement of three professors at the university. So, and at one point, there was a 6-month period where there were no professors. So you often had one, usually two professors. So he was sort of filling the gap there. And the second reason is that among those who were teaching, Episcopius, of course, at the university, and Petrus Bertius at the college, the regent of the college, they were open remonstrants. So he was trying to provide Orthodox Reformed alternative to their teaching. So much for Homius. The various forms of Homius's instruction at Leiden, whether on homiletics, on the Heidelberg Catechism, or against Bellarmine, was all private and held in his home. Though it was done outside the regular curriculum of the Stoughton College and the theology faculty of Leiden University, the students he taught were regular theology students at the college and university, and Homius's private instruction was supplemental then to their regular studies. Now, even after the Synod of Dort in the summer of 1619, Homius was still functioning privately to supervise and examine theology students who were preparing to take the examination to enter the ministry. With the purge of the university in 1619, Homius was appointed regent of the Stoughton College in July 1619. Homius's private role in the superintendence and examination of these students was then taken up by Ames. This was clearly a part-time task, since Homius's main task was minister. Ames' role in the superintendence and inspection of these students, which he took over from Homius toward the end of 1619, is not exactly clear. This was not an official function of the Stoughton College. The examination of these students that they were preparing to take was likely the classis examination before their ordination. It does not seem that Ames was the actual examiner of these students. That was the task of the commissioners, who apparently were the classis examiners. Ames' role was to help prepare them for the classis exam, and for this purpose he drew up the first draft of his Medulla, whatever form that teaching took, perhaps private lectures, perhaps private disputations. At any rate, the instruction Ames gave these students was private and offered in his home. But the evidence does not support the conclusion of some Ames scholars that he was operating a small private house college. That's basically because the students were regular students living at the Stoughton College. Second stage, separate disputations of a disputation cycle in 1622 and 23. After being appointed as Professor Ordinarius of Theology at Franeker University in March 1622, Ames began his teaching with an inaugural oration on 23 May. 1 month later, he began presiding over a public cycle of disputations on the topics of dogmatic theology. This cycle ran from 26 June 1622 until early December 1623. During the academic year, these disputations were held on average 4 to 6 times a month, often twice a week. These disputations consisted of 2 parts. The first part including 41 disputations on faith, the second part 26 disputations on observance. Disputations of the first part ended on April of 1623, then after a 4.5-month break. The second part ran twice a week from September to early December of 1623. As was customary in that day, the theses for individual disputations were published separately as pamphlets just prior to the conducting of each disputation. In this case, each was 8 pages long. Johannes Lumrink published the initial 18 disputations until he died, and Ulricus Balk, printer for the university, published the remaining disputations. Both were based in Franeker. It's also important to note that prior to the cycle presided by Ames, there had already been 11 disputation cycles in theology conducted at Franeker University. Only one, presided by Maccovius, had been published. Moving to the third stage, the 1623 first edition of the Medulla. Immediately after the disputation cycle was completed in December 1623, it appears that the printer Ulricus Balk simply gathered together copies of the individual disputations and bound them together so that the whole cycle could be distributed as a single volume. Balk only added the title page with the title Medulla Sacrae Theologiae Bipartita, that is, bipartite marrow of sacred theology in a genuine method publicly proposed in theses at the Frisian Academy. On the back of the title page were listed the names of the 6 student respondents who defended the disputations of Part 1. Thus was produced the first printed edition of the Medulla in 1623 in the form of a cycle of disputations. Now, since the print run of individual disputations was quite small, they were intended mainly for disputation participants and auditors. This may account for the fact that the first edition of the Medulla, produced by Balk, is so rare. As far as I can determine, there are only 3 extant copies in the world of the first edition of Ames Medulla, none of them complete. The first copy, which you see here, is in the Houghton Library at Harvard. This copy includes the title page, the 41 disputations of Part 1 on faith, the 22 disputation, and 22 of the 26 disputations of Part 2 on observance. The last 4 disputations are lacking a total of 38 pages. So that's what the last page looks like. Due to the missing pages, it's uncertain whether Ames included a Ramus chart at the end of the first edition, as was found in the second edition. Secondly, there's a partial copy at the Pitts Theology Library in Atlanta. This copy includes only the first half of the book, the 41 disputations of Part 1. And then third, Oxford University has a partial copy that includes the title page and only the first 17 disputations of Part 1. So in other words, about a quarter of the book. Now, all the disputations of Part 1 have separate title pages. Here's a typical one, as is typical of separately published disputation theses. These title pages provide the number of the disputation in the cycle. So you know their cycles when the disputation is numbered 1, 2, or 3, or 4. This is number 1. The disputation title, the name of the presider, in this case Ames, the name of the student respondent, the date the disputation was held, and the printer. The back of the title page often contains, in Ames here, a dedication by the respondent to 1 or 2 persons. You can see that on the left side. Now, Part 2 of this Harvard copy does not have a separate title page. Looks like that, and individual disputations do not have title pages, as is characteristic of the first part. There were a total of 8 students who participated in this disputation cycle as respondents defending the theses. 6 rotated to defend the disputations of part 1, and 6 defended those of part 2. The 4 respondents who participated in both parts each defended 11 or 12 disputations. 7 of the 8 respondents were Dutch students. The other, John Rowe, was an English student. Now it's clear already in this first edition that this was not just a loose collection of unrelated disputations. As the general title indicates, Ames intended the cycle to be an integral whole arranged by a genuine method. The 2 parts on faith and observance encompass the whole of theology, and these 2 parts are preceded by 2 introductory disputations on the definition and division of theology. Frequently, connecting comments are included in the disputations, you'll see it up on top on the left, to indicate how the disputation topics fit together as an organic whole. These connecting comments generally reveal a pattern of dichotomizing topics. Thus, it's clear that Ames' genuine method is the typical Ramist method of dichotomization. Now, the disputations themselves consist of a list of theses to be defended, numbering in the range between 15 and 74 theses. Many of the disputations also include 1 to 4 corollaries, as you'll see on the right. Now, it's noteworthy that Ames himself provided over all the disputations of this cycle. Unlike the practice at Leiden, where 4 theologians conducted the disputations of the Synopsis in turn, Ames did not rotate in presiding over these dogmatic topics with his colleagues, Sibrandus Lubertus and Johannes Maccovius. Moving to the last stage, number 4, the revised 1627 Medulla. In 1627, Ames revised the disputation cycle and made it into the famous compendium, which was published then in Amsterdam. Now, what difference is there between the first edition of 1623 and the second edition of 1627? First, the title of the work is revised. Here's the translation: Marrow of Sacred Theology, extracted from Holy Scriptures and its interpreters, and methodically arranged. In this edition, Ames added the dedication to the Amsterdam merchants, as well as a brief forewarning to obviate objections to his method of producing a compendium. At the end of the volume, he added a Ramist chart presenting the bifurcated methodus of the contents of the Medulla. In the second edition, Ames reworked the form of the disputation cycle and converted it into a theology textbook in the form of a compendium, while retaining most of the content of the first edition. As for the change in form, almost all hints of a disputation cycle disappear in the 1627 edition. The disputations become chapters. The separate title pages disappear, as you see here, along with any reference to the names of the remonstrants, of the respondents, the dates of the disputations, and the dedications. All corollaries are also omitted. The topics in some cases are rearranged. Some disputations are combined and others split. In spite of the ordering, part 1 of the second edition still has 41 chapters, but part 2 is reduced from 26 to 22 chapters. You've been handed a chart there that compares the 2 editions and the number of theses in each disputation or chapter. So it looks like that. Now, nevertheless, the basic content of every topic in the disputation cycle is retained, even though it is somewhat reworked, reorganized, and slightly expanded. The bipartite structure remains, and every topic found in the disputation cycle is retained. So closely is the content retained that in almost every case, the number of disputations or number of theses on a given topic is the same or roughly similar. Compared to the 67 disputations of the first edition, only 15 chapters in the second edition have a different number of theses. The greatest difference appears in the first 2 introductory chapters on the definition and division of theology. Now, just a quick comparison of some disputations and chapters in the 2 editions. Since the 2 introductory chapters are the most significantly revised, they're worth some attention. In Disputation Chapter 1 on the definition of theology, Ames reduced the 27 theses and 3 corollaries to 13 theses in the 27 edition. 11 of the original theses reappear in some form in the second edition, though the revised theses are more detailed. 4 of the 13 theses in this edition are completely new. Now, of particular interest in this second edition is the first edition is the definition of theology. Theology is the doctrine of living well to God. Now, this definition is more clearly Ramist than the second edition. The Ramist definition is theology is the doctrine of living well. The second edition is a little different. Theology is the doctrine of living to God. Now, in chapter 2, on the division of theology, the 21 theses and 3 corollaries of the first edition are reduced by Ames and recast into 5 theses in the Revised Version. In the second disputation, the 1623 edition the original edition rejects a variety of proposed divisions of theology, including natural and supernatural theology, archetypal and ectypal theology, God and His works, law, gospel, precepts and promises, pathological and therapeutic, faith, hope, and charity, end, means, and attaining the end. Since the spiritual life is the proper object of theology, it says, theology is divided according to the 2 parts of the spiritual life, faith and observance or obedience. Now, even this division of theology is thoroughly Ramist. Though Ramus himself followed the common catechetical practice of dividing his theology into 4 books rather than 2, faith, law, Lord's Prayer, and sacraments, his larger framework is faith and the actions of faith and or observance, exactly the 2 divisions used by Ames. This second chapter of Ames' 1627 edition simplifies the analysis of the division of theology, and in 5 theses just explains the division in 2 parts, faith and observance. One more sample, chapter 3 on faith is more typical of revisions made by Ames throughout the rest of the 1627 edition. So the first 2 disputations are very different, the rest are very similar. In this chapter, the content is substantially the same as the original edition, though augmented somewhat. In fact, the number of theses is exactly the same. Ames only revised the content of 6 of the 22 theses by adding several lines for clarification. Here you see, there it is. You see the red marks and so on, what the changes are on one page. He also added actual biblical quotations where the first edition just gives the biblical references. But he also omits many of the original biblical references. Then the final sample, Disputation 25 on predestination, reveals the same pattern of slight revision without significant change in content. Again, both editions have the same number of theses, but the corollary of the original edition, which is there at the end, the canons of the Synod of Dort concerning predestination agree with the Word of God, is omitted in the revised edition. Conclusion. Ames' Medulla as a disputation cycle clearly preceded the Leiden synopsis by 2 years. But I do not claim that the 1623 Medulla was a precursor to the 1625 synopsis in the sense that there was a direct influence on its content. The arrangement of topics and the specific content of the two are significantly different. The Synopsis is much more detailed and scholastic in its terminology and in its analysis. While both reflected the Reformed Orthodoxy after the Synod of Dort, the two works have a rather different theological orientation. The Medulla has a distinct Ramist character. The Synopsis is more scholastic. But as for form, the Synopsis had several disputation cycles close at hand in Leiden, after which it could have been modeled. But there were only two previously published cycles at Leiden, the Compendium of 1611 and the Syntagma of 1615. The Franeker Medulla provided just one more model of a published disputation cycle of dogmatic theology. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll hold our questions to the end. We'll just move on down the line. Dr. Blacketer.
Thank you. We're talking about the Sabbath. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. Talking about the Sabbath and the Synopsis, the Sabbath disputation in the context of the Dutch Sabbath controversy. North Americans nurtured in the more conservative churches of the Dutch Reformed tradition can be forgiven for assuming that the Netherlands of their ancestors must have been a uniformly Sabbatarian land, one that erected rigid Sunday rules to keep out worldliness as surely as a strong dike holds back the sea. But in fact, a storm was rising in the Netherlands over conflicting understandings of the fourth commandment, one that increased in intensity as the 17th century wore on. Abraham Kuyper could still lament its divisive effects in 1890. The Sabbath question, he observed, had divided the minds and feelings of the country, so much so that people presumed to judge a person's entire religious perspective just by asking their opinion on the Sabbath. At the beginning of the 17th century, the English Puritan view of the Sabbath found favor with some Dutch clergy who promoted it zealously. But the more moderate and spiritualized understanding of the practice of the Sabbath, or the lack of practice of the Sabbath, still prevailed in the Netherlands. Lambert Dano, who held the chair of theology at Leiden for a very short time, nonetheless exhibited considerable influence on Dutch theological thought. Dano is typical in elaborating the more traditional distinction between the ceremonial and moral components of the fourth commandment, which one finds broadly in the Christian tradition and in the writings of reformers such as Calvin. He affirmed that resting from servile or slavish work was part of the ceremonial nature of the commandment and thus no longer binding on Christians. That's quite typical. The British delegation to the Synod of Dort, however, recorded their complaints about the laxity of Sunday observance in the city of Dordrecht, which had caused them, quote, great offense. Bishop Carleton concluded his farewell address to the States General with a couple of exhortations. The first was a plea for stricter ecclesiastical authority and to suppress the liberty of preaching, because contrary to the Belgian Confession, pastors are not all equal and Christ is not the only bishop of the church, said the bishop. And secondly, would you please pay attention to the terrible state of Sabbath observance in the Netherlands, because Christ himself commends the Sabbath and because the Lord's Day is, quote, the Christian Sabbath. In fact, the English separatists who had taken refuge in Leiden listed as one of their reasons for departing Holland for the New World, these are the Pilgrim Fathers, they cited as one of the main reasons their failure to reform the hopelessly lax Sabbath practices of the Dutch churches. The province of Zeeland was a particular hotbed of Sabbatarian zeal, and it was the birthplace of the Sabbath controversy only 2 years after the publication of the Synopsis Purioris Theologiae. The pastor of Middelburg at that time was Willem Teylink, pioneer of the Nadere Reformatie, the Dutch Further Reformation, who was strongly influenced by English Sabbath piety. The Puritan preacher Hugh Peters, an Englishman of Dutch parentage, writes, "I was a witness that Middelburg in Zeeland grew famous for religion by Teylink, their preacher, fetching the keeping of the Sabbath from England." Zeeland was one of the classes that had sent a gravamen to the Synod of Dort to address what was seen as widespread Sabbath desecration in the land. 6, quote, "regulations concerning the keeping of the Sabbath or day of the Lord, formulated by the professors with the consent of the brethren of Zeeland, were read and approved." These statements were quite moderate. However, the Acts make it sound like this settled the matter for the Zeeland delegates, but in fact, they considered it more of a provisional compromise. The details were to be hammered out at the next National Synod, and we know how that turned out. There wasn't one. The Synod was particularly concerned with poor church attendance in the afternoon catechism services. And any pastors here, you can take heart that this is not a new problem. I thought it was just me and my church. And the Synod admonished pastors not to cancel services, especially in the Kleine Dorpen, the little villages, when no one showed up, but rather to just preach to their own families if necessary. My kids would be all over that. The Dutch Sabbath controversy, however, began in earnest in 1627 when Jacobus Boers, pastor of the church in Tolen, also in Zeeland, published a treatise defending the Synod of Dort against critics like Teylink and his brother Ewout, who claimed its Sabbath declarations did not go far enough. With the publication of this treatise, Boers, by the way, received superior grade theological ammunition from a rather learned source, Professor Franciscus Gomarus, whose views had circulated in manuscript form before their publication, and who had himself lived in Zeeland, in Middelburg, in fact, and he had likely had firsthand experience with the Sabbath piety there. Now, Gomarus's views did not go unopposed, and he received a rebuttal in the form of an anonymous tract with a fantastic, awesome title, "Wiping Away Crocodile Tears," written by a certain Gijsbert Futsius. The youngest delegate at the Synod of Dort, Futsius was a powerful advocate for the piety of the Nadere Reformatie, and he figured largely throughout both stages of the Dutch Sabbath controversy. So, when the Synopsis was being prepared, these tensions over the doctrine and practice of the Sabbath were simmering, but had not yet erupted into open conflict. Commenting on the controversy, the 19th century Lutheran scholar E.W. Hengstenberg claimed, "No attention in the controversy was paid to a moderate theologian, Theseus, who warned them not to attach too great importance to their differences and either to be silent or at least to tolerate each other." Now, whether Theseus ever said any such thing, I rather doubt. But it's a reasonable extrapolation from the conciliatory tone of the Sabbath disputation in the Synopsis, and that is genuinely noteworthy. Antonius Theseus published far less than his colleagues Willeus or Rivet, but he never waded into the Sabbath controversy when it broke out. His disputation in the Synopsis on the Sabbath and the Lord's Day begins with theses that review the background of the commandment, that they manifest an interest in philology and the historical background and context. He defines the Sabbath as a weekly festival instituted by God in which the Jews, following God's own pattern of ceasing from his creative work on the seventh day, were commanded by God to scrupulously or religiously, religiosa, refrain from their servile and everyday work and to be occupied with the holy exercises of divine worship. The Sabbath precept differs from all the others, he argues, in that it does not arise out of a natural necessity, nor is it something that is implanted in the human heart or known by nature. Rather, it is a piece of positive legislation arising out of God's free decision and by his decree. God could have ordained otherwise, for example, choosing a different day of the week, or choosing the beginning of the week rather than the end to commemorate his work of creation. Theseus then comes to a matter that will prove very controversial. Whether God established the Sabbath at the beginning of creation and intended it for all of humanity, or whether he instituted it at the time of the Mosaic Law and intended it particularly for the Jewish people. We read in Genesis 2 that God rested on the seventh day, blessed that day, and sanctified it, which, as Theseus interprets it, means that he set it apart from the other days for the purpose of human worship. But Theseus, rather diplomatically, says that it is not clear whether he instituted the use of that day, that is, whether he instituted the practice for human beings to rest and to worship on that day, whether he instituted it already in paradise, or whether it was established only later, during the time of Moses. In the latter case, if it was instituted in the time of Moses, the reference to God's rest on the seventh day in Genesis would be an instance of prolepsis. It would anticipate, that is, the later institution of the Jewish Sabbath. It's safe to assume that Theseus knew that there was quite a diversity of opinion, even among Dutch professors on this subject. Former Leiden professor Gomarus, for one, would soon publicly advance the argument that the establishment of the Sabbath day as a binding ritual did not occur in paradise, but only later with Israel in the wilderness, specifically when God sent manna raining down from the heavens. Now, two Leiden theologians, Antonius Walaeus and Andreas Reve, disagreed with him, and they would respond with opposite arguments that the Sabbath day was in fact instituted at the beginning of creation. While there were substantive differences and disagreements, the debate was remarkably civil. Gomarus, in his response to Reve, noted that even though they differed on this point, he was glad that they agreed that Christians must reserve a regularly recurring day of the week for the service of God, and that the bonds of faith and friendship remained intact. By contrast, in the second stage of the controversy, when Johannes Cocceius advocated similar views 25 years later, the resulting clash with Johannes Hornbeck, a student of Fuchsius, by the way, would not end so well and would have lasting divisive effects on Dutch religious society. Theseus, however, is not finished with this topic. In Thesis 14, Theseus notes that the Sabbath day is never mentioned in Scripture before the publication of the Mosaic Law in the wilderness, though the concept is introduced in the wilderness before the commandment was given on the mountain. This was either because the Sabbath was first instituted with the miracle of the manna in Exodus 16, or it could be the case that Moses was working to revive a pre-existing practice of Sabbath rest before he received the law on Sinai. However, Theseus argues that the Sabbath was given exclusively to the Israelites and that it was something that the Lord revealed to them that had previously been entirely unknown. Thus, the prior interpretation seems more likely to Theseus, namely, that the Sabbath was instituted in the time of Moses. In other words, it seems that Theseus tends toward the opinion of Gomarus and not Reve and Walaeus, but he reveals this opinion in a rather understated, provisional, and nuanced manner, one that would be less likely to offend his colleagues or give the impression that the theology professors were divided, even if they disagreed. This is in keeping with one of the main purposes of the Synopsis, to present a unified and functional theology faculty at Leiden. The differences did not go unnoticed across the English Channel, however. The British were engaged in their own polemics over how to understand and observe the Lord's Day, and they made reference to the various and conflicting arguments of these Dutch theologians in their own disputes. So, for example, the noted theologian and Sabbatarian William Twiss took both Revetus and Willeus to task at length in his treatise on the perpetual morality of the fourth commandment, and both of these Leiden professors were thought to take a stricter position than Gomarus. I think Gomarus must have been completely beyond the pale. Further on in the Disputation, Theseus lists as one of the goals of the Sabbath human sanctification. In addition to possibly mirroring the Heidelberg Catechism on the fourth commandment, as Remer Faber has pointed out, Theseus here reflects a long tradition of spiritual interpretation of the Sabbath going back to Justin Martyr, who says that the real meaning of the Sabbath is to cease, take a break from sinful acts, and enjoy a perpetual Sabbath of holiness. Theseus proceeds then to the meaning and purpose of the Sabbath day, noting along the way how the Sabbath was kept by the Jews and also some of the excesses of the Pharisees, what is often referred to as superstition. In Thesis 36, he makes the interesting point that activities aimed at modest bodily invigoration and relaxation are not prohibited, provided that they do not hinder the chief function and worship of the Sabbath. In fact, Theseus notes, on feast days, the Jews were accustomed to make merry, though this could lead to excesses. Willeus would later make a similar comment, noting that physical recreations and delights are not forbidden by the fourth commandment, as long as they do not include anything obscene or profane. You wonder if that was okay on Friday or Monday, and as long as they occur after worship and not before or during or in place of such worship. Willeus cites the example from Nehemiah 8, where the Jews feast and celebrate on the holy day, but only after Ezra has finished with his sermon. Theseus stayed within the general framework laid out in the Synod of Dort, while deepening the discussion philologically, historically, and theologically. Theseus was certainly aware of the differences among leading Dutch Orthodox theologians, perhaps even among the Leiden professors. The Disputation is certainly not lacking in the practical application of the fourth commandment to the life of both public and private piety, but nonetheless, it does not accede to the pressures of nonconformist English Sabbatarianism. Indeed, some Dutch divines seem to resent the English pietist influence in their country. While some saw it as a much-needed enrichment of Dutch piety, others viewed it as a foreign contamination. Godefridus Udemans, pastor at Zierikzee in Zeeland and vice president at the National Synod, claimed rather optimistically that the Puritan and Zeeland opinion on the hallowing of the Sabbath was entirely in line with the Dutch and foreign delegates at the Synod. But this stands in contrast to the complaint recorded by John Owen a generation later that various Dutch clergy referred to the distinctive Sabbatarian views of the Puritans as the figmentum Anglicanum, the English fiction. Indeed, in the second, more acrimonious phase of the Dutch Sabbath controversy, Johannes Coxeus would complain to a friend about an attack on his thinking during a recent ecclesiastical assembly. He writes, "There was a speaker at the synod who labeled what we had discovered from our teachers regarding the Sabbath commandment as a new theology, novel doctrine. No wonder. Anything that is not in accord with the English is new to him." In conclusion, Theseus demonstrated how the undeniable diversity of thought in the Reformed tradition could be acknowledged or at least managed, and yet not allowed to become a threat to unity and harmony. By doing so, he charted a prudent course. The combatants in the second phase of the Dutch Sabbath controversy, the Futsians and the Coxeans, did not maintain this unity, and as a result, they left the Dutch churches with no rest. Thank you.
Dr. Beach.
My
My topic is more dogmatically oriented and less historically oriented, so I'm more interested in the content of the synopsis itself on this topic of free choice, which Dr. Stainland alluded to last night. My topic, no longer totally depraved, free choice in the regenerate according to the synopsis. My experience in the pastorate and from time to time teaching in the classroom at the seminary level on this topic of the Reformed understanding of free choice and free will, I have met with some opposition to the notion that believers are no longer totally depraved. That may strike you as odd or as obvious or as offensive, depending on how you were taught to think about these things. But it seems to me that according to theological precision, within the Reformed tradition, it's erroneous to speak of regenerate persons as totally depraved, and then within the narrow confines of my topic, depravity vis-a-vis free choice, specifically intellect and will as faculties components of that. When we carefully define, and not only depravity, but carefully define regeneration, this, at least for me, is not a controversial claim. But more, this statement of the Synopsis Purioris explicitly states that the depravity afflicting the human will is taken away and uprightness implanted. The understanding, similarly, is granted new abilities so that the two principal areas or faculties of free choice, whether we're talking about human will or the understanding, each being afflicted by depravity, find relief in the way of regeneration. Now, initially I was going to spend some time dealing with total depravity in the canons of Dort, but I would just note in head 3-4, the very last part of Article 1, it talking about human depravity, namely that with the fall, in the place of the outstanding gifts man is brought upon himself blindness, terrible darkness, futility and distortion of judgment in his mind, perversity, defiance and hardness in his heart and will, those are deliberate terms, and finally impurity in all his emotions. So suffice it that the Dort does teach total depravity vis-a-vis free choice in a fallen state. So what I want to do next is quickly look at the synopsis on free choice and then return a bit to the canons and show how the synopsis, in my view, is seeking to be a pure theology in harmony with the canons. In fact, I guess my view is that following the Synod of Dort and following then a period of controversy and very sharp polemics, and then following a period of very, at perhaps extreme positions taken given the nature of polemics, the synopsis seeks to be a centrist document as the canons themselves seek to be. And that also in this question of free choice. The theologians of the synopsis, as bearers of the Dort inheritance, take on this topic very deliberately, and they take it up in Disputation 17. This follows upon discussions that treat man as the divine image bearer, and after distinct discussions on Adam's fall, original sin, and actual sin, then comes the topic of free choice. The synopsis, however, examines that topic not only from the perspective of human fallenness, but in doing that, it handles the topic under the familiar fourfold state made commonplace by Augustine. Says the synopsis, whereas the order in this series of disputations would require us to provide a treatment of man's free choice and its power as seen after the fall, for the sake of a fuller understanding, we shall treat free choice in general and as it regards all the states of man. Well, if I had time, I would take you meticulously through its analysis of free choice in general, but I have to skim the surface here to get to the heart of the topic. But what is in purview is human choice, specifically man's powers, what human will can achieve, and then, of course, following the fall, what it can't achieve, and following rebirth and redemption, what it can achieve. The synopsis is very careful to set forth a taxonomy of terms, Greek and Latin terms. Theseus himself is most interested in a biblical term, hakusion, maybe the Latin equivalent being the Latinate word spontaneity. And though the many different technical terms have their place, they also have certain liabilities. What is understood by free choice is that it resides in the will alone, says the synopsis, rather than as resting in two cooperating faculties, the intellect and the will, even though the latter view is not uncommon in medieval and Reformed scholastic thinking. And thus it seems here Theseus is a bit more schodistic than Thomistic. It is not, strictly speaking, a mental judgment or choice. Rather, it denotes to choose or not to choose or to reject. Although he is quick to say that the intellect or mental judgment is not jettisoned in the role of free choice, he simply argues that the proper faculty or subject of free choice to be the will, though, quote, the mind's counsel and judgment occur first and must of necessity precede, for the will follows the judgment of reason. Well, he lays out very carefully the nature of free choice, and he is particularly takes care to relate that to questions of necessity. Free choice pertains to man's will, both the faculty of the will itself and its act, and how it relates to these various objects, namely natural life, of physical necessities, political, civic life, and then most importantly, spiritual, religious life. How it relates to these various objects. The general answer is that a human wills and does everything that he wills and chooses to do, not out of natural necessity, certainly not out of mere physical appetites, nor does he will and do anything coerced by external force or against his will or unwillingly, so no necessity of coaction or compulsion. All these would be contrary to free will or free choice. It's always upon prior deliberation, spontaneously, voluntarily, and freely, so that he's able and suited by a principle within himself to suspend his will and to delay choosing between one object and another, or its opposite, or a different one. That man is capable of choosing or willing this or that, and of preferring one thing over another by means of a direct or indirect faculty. And this is the nature and property of the human will. It is perpetual, meaning whatever state he's in, this kind of function abides, whether in a state of sin, a state of grace. So choice remains free, but this isn't to deny the effects of the inherent quality of a faculty, whether good or bad, in relation to choice. There is a proximate principle and cause of the will in its acts, whether good or bad, by which choice is tied to that proximate principle is judged to be free or not free. Well, that brings the synopsis to an analysis of the fourfold state, beginning with the state of creation and integrity, followed by the state of fall and corruption, the state of grace and restoration, and finally the state of glory and perfection. Moving just briefly, a few highlights of the nature of free choice in a state of corruption. Following the fall, man infected by original sin lost the righteousness and goodness both in his intellect and will, for now he's inclined sinfully. He did not lose, however, the intellect in his intelligence, though it's wholly corrupted. He did not lose the natural freedom of choice in his will. He is still a choice maker then. Nor did he lose his natural faculties, which form the foundation or the principle of his actions. He retained the remote and passive ability to undertake the opposite. Free choice, then, is directed by that proximate and active capability under the sway of the devil, in a state of corruption, so that it is drawn no longer toward the good, that is truly good, but only toward evil that only appears good. Choice is directed by the nearest principle, and as such, it is necessarily carried off freely, willingly, and of its own accord. Of course, what it chooses is freely, willingly, is evil. The synopsis makes clear that there's remnants, tiny sparks of goodness, and in the interest of time, I will just forego looking at that for now. It also makes the point that whatever remnants, tiny sparks there are, though relatively good, they're not ultimately good because the actions, the persons, the efficient cause of these actions, these choices, is not pleasing to God. Their actions are not derived from a pure source, true knowledge of God, faith in Him, reverence toward Him, nor do they have as their final aim God's glory. So they might be good, be called good works in one respect because they result in good or good of themselves, but in a more fundamental, ultimate respect, they remain sinful and counted as sins, for they are not done rightly. Well, then, for clarity, what is depraved? What is the nature of this depravity in its totality regarding free choice? As noted above, in inward and spiritual matters, man in a corrupted state can do only evil. His intellect is mostly ignorant of the substance of God's law, beginning with the first commandment, who's the true God. Worse, his intellect is ignorant of the substance of the gospel, which is supernatural, beyond the intellect and will. Such things can only be grasped with the firm conviction and supernatural light and the supernatural eye, which is faith. So also, the will, bound by depravity, wills, chooses, desires, accomplishes things opposite to the supernatural ones. The result of this depravity in spiritual matters, this ignorance of intellect, of God's law and gospel, this lack of faith, and the will bound by depravity, this all plays out too in a total, quoting the synopsis, in a total inability to rise up from sin, to cast off his ignorance and depraved tendencies and to turn toward God, end quote. He cannot will himself to receive, to commence, and to effect new and spiritual motions such as true repentance, faith, reverence, love of God, neighbor, calling upon Him. This is his depraved state. This is his broken, ignorant intellect and befouled will, out of which he chooses. Moving then to a state, well, one last thing. So on one level, he's still a free choice maker because he makes makes choices from out of his own nature, befouled, but it's better to say that he's in bondage because of where that befouled nature takes him, that he's sold under sin, and in that way does not have free will. But what happens when man is now in a state of grace? In treating human free choice in the state of grace and restoration, the synopsis is first concerned to accent that human choice is initially passive, not cooperative in this transition. The transition from a state of depravity to one of grace and restoration demands, not surprisingly, divine grace, the efficacious power of the Holy Spirit. This is the path to becoming spiritual versus carnal. In so doing, God grants the believer, listen to these words, God grants the believer a new disposition, habatu novo. This is infused into him, infuso, and the sinner's free will, free choice, actually his enslaved will, is liberated and rendered truly free. This transformation in man's willing is only a beginning, but as a beginning, it is also progressive, persistent, and steadfast toward the good. To be sure, in this transition, man, this transition from death to life, man begins in a wholly passive manner. Passivity, however, does not render the sinner inert as if he were a block of wood. Although the will of the fallen sinner remains initially passive in the divine work of restoration and renewal, humans, not being wood blocks, even fallen, corrupted humans, are active subjects endowed with the faculties of mind and will. Thus, even the renewing work of the Spirit is an operation in which God employs His Word, which addresses the mind and the emotions, and yet the efficacy remains with God, not because of the sinner's compliance as such. God works in man such as he is, that is, broken, befouled, entirely weak, bound to evil. Included in this regenerating work, the synopsis makes it explicit that liberation comes to human will. For God works powerfully and efficaciously so that, quote, he effectively takes the depravity out of the will and implants uprightness in it, so that man is changed from unwilling to willing and from resisting God to obeying him. This is recreation, regeneration, awakening, and it's entirely God's work. Moreover, the synopsis again heads off what it regards as semi-Pelagian notions of cooperation, but it doesn't deny that there can be some sort of prior preparations, nor does it deny the use of means, namely the preaching of the word. So what specifically are the effects of regeneration? The synopsis is careful to define them, for as regeneration means that God bestows the ability and principle of willing and doing good, and this is entire in scope, but for now partial in degree. In other words, as depravity is pervasive, covers all of human nature, so likewise the nature of regeneration or renewal is pervasive, covers all of human nature, but that doesn't mean it's reached its entire and fullest degree or intensity of degrees or highest degree. It's partial to a lesser degree in which the contrary can and does exist, which is to say, in the work of renewal, all aspects of fallen nature, both the intellect and the will, are under this new regenerating influence. The whole man infected with depravity, the whole man is infected with depravity, and so the whole man comes under the reforming effects of regeneration. However, total or complete renewal does not take place all at once. Quote, remnants of our sinful nature remain in the mind, the will, the feelings, and the capability and power to act. And so as a result, recognition is obscured. The will and feelings are more limited, and the power weakened, so much so that we do not achieve everything we wish to do. This is because there are different principles, two opposing parts in opposition to each other, a natural and a spiritual part, flesh and spirit. And even more radically, the synopsis nearly posits two persons as comprising the believer, the old and the new, the outer and the inner, the revealed and the hidden. These opposing principles in a regenerate person, but it is one person, are like two persons in opposition to one another within that one person. It's the big spiritual battle. And when a believer is making spiritual progress, he's called spiritual. And when he's in spiritual regress, he's called carnal. The spiritual battle also plays out in the believer's exercise of free choice. The renewal wrought in the believer by the Holy Spirit, though only in a partial degree, means, quote, that his free choice relates partly to the good and partly to the bad, end quote. Given the new capacity planted in him, new powers, inclinations, movements, which are in his mind and will, man in a state of grace accompanied by the Spirit, quote, understands, wills, and achieves spiritual things. End quote. Man's obedience in a way of faith, repentance, holiness is in harmony with God. So much so that he begins, strives, manages to devote himself to inward and outward obedience or good works pleasing to God. In spiritual matters, he wills and does what concerns God's kingdom. And in civil matters pertaining to outward self-discipline, the believer wills and does these things, the believer, out of faith into God's glory. The unbeliever doesn't do that. The believer does that. These works of obedience are good, inasmuch as they conform to the norm of God's law. They rest on good principle of divine regeneration of the Spirit's activity, and who continues to improve them. Though remnants of flesh still sully humanity with many blemishes. But the point the synopsis is jealous to make, and is clear to make, is with all these weaknesses in the believer, because of the Holy Spirit, and because nonetheless it's good, he's counted as good, his works are reckoned and accepted as good, even forgiven by Christ, but it's because what predominates in the believer is not the flesh, but the Spirit. The spiritual part of the person in the state of grace. The synopsis next takes up, I must quickly press on for time, it makes the point that the spiritual part in this battle, the dominant part is the spiritual part, and the regenerate person does not remain merely passive in responding into the work of grace as engaged, in being engaged as an agent. The synopsis has a nice analogy here. It likens the believer to a toddler who, led by his nurse and steadied by her hand as he begins to walk, and like a young boy who learns how to write as his teacher guides his hand, and then writes on his own because he's both acted upon and acts himself. Therefore, the will is not idle, but when liberated, possesses some freedom in action. This affirmation that the will is not idle, but activated, or that's the canon's favorite word, doesn't mean that free choice is directed only to the good. Again, there's remnants of flesh. But the renewal of this nature, which begins and includes mind, will, feeling, power to act, has only begun, but it has begun. It's not yet perfected, but it is underway, and it is itself purposefully active. So the synopsis teaches that the regenerate person cannot reach perfection in this life. That ought not to surprise you. The nearest or proximate cause is the imperfection present, namely that which is nearest and proximate as bad choice, or is motivating bad choice. And that's why we cannot live a life of piety without stumblings and interruptions. God does not abandon us in our stumblings and failings. The depravity residing in us is not total depravity. It's not ruling, reigning, dominant depravity. God never forsakes this sufficient bestowal of His grace of regeneration so that sin rules the believer. So hastening on, our time is quickly going by. From the synopsis, or this brief synopsis of the synopsis, we see that totally depraved persons upon rebirth and renewal by the Holy Spirit are no longer totally depraved. I didn't say they didn't have any kind of depravity. First, regeneration itself, after the initial immediate operation of the Holy Spirit, proceeds in a mediated manner, engaging humans as rational moral creatures with will and understanding. And so the Word of God is instrument for that purpose. We're not wood blocks. Two, free choice, the freedom to be choice makers, abides in each state humans find themselves, but these choices are governed by internal principles, which nevertheless give expression to what one desires or wants or wills and takes pleasure in. Thirdly, the will is renewed, given a new principle or foundation from which choice proceeds. Fourth, the understanding is likewise enlightened and able to discern law and gospel, to embrace with delight God's will and spiritual realities in the way of faith, and to even do civic and domestic good from faith and for God's glory. And although great weakness remains in the believer until he or she is ushered into the consummate state of non possec peccara, still the dominating principle in the believer is for the good. For depravity no longer rules or reigns, and not a total depravity in those regenerated. I'm going to trust that you can trust me. You can point to numerous places in Dort where almost identical language is used, and I think that's very deliberate on the synopsis part for its pure, mild theology.
We now have some time for some questions, so if there are any, who would like to?
Thank you, men, all three of you, very interesting and valuable. I'm going to, Russ Dykstra, Protestant Reformed Seminary. Dr. Beach, I want to address my question to you. Does the synopsis deal at all, and I like the language, I appreciate everything about it, but do they deal at all with the question of Romans 7 from the point of view of that in my flesh, that in me that is in my flesh, there dwelleth no good thing? Because you think the point you made is regeneration covers all of the human nature, and I just wonder if they interacted with that at all.
I do recall a reference in connection with the battle within the believer because of the battle of flesh and spirit. It does reference Romans 7 in that this accounts for why we're not able to always do as we wish.
That statement, in my flesh.
I don't recall the synopsis taking on specific exegetical points like that. In fact, I don't find that characteristic, at least, of Disputation 17.
Yeah, Dr. Beach, when we talk about the regenerate person, we talk not being totally depraved anymore, but we still hedge in the sense that some of the effects of depravity are still active, correct?
Yes.
But then when we talk about the unregenerate person, we seem to speak in absolute terms, in terms of their depravity. And my question is, has a totally depraved person ever existed on planet Earth in light of God's common grace, or if we don't like that term, in light of his providence to accomplish his purposes in the world?
I skipped this part of my presentation, but under treatment of man in a state of corruption, like Dort, it takes up that question of remnants and sparks of goodness. And in that connection, it makes the point that with respect to matters that pertain to natural civic life, in affairs subject to reason, the senses, external discipline, corporal justice, remnants and tiny sparks of goodness survive. What it's going to argue is that's a good in itself, but it's not an ultimate good. That's my language, ultimate good. It's not a good, finally, that merits anything before God, because it's not from faith, it's not from a right foundation motive, and it's not for his glory. So, but it is a relative good. So if an unbeliever comes and helps you with your flat tire, and you don't have to get your nice suit dirty, and he does all the work, which actually happened to me once. I was on a hospital call. He did all the stuff. He did me a good, right? I mean, that was a good thing. It's better than that he shot me, or or that he slashed my other tires and drove away and laughed. I mean, he did it. But assuming he was an unbeliever, did this somehow earn eternal life or something? Of course not. He did. It was good in itself, but it wasn't good motivated by a heart born of the Spirit, nor for God's glory, etc., or out of faith.
So he had an inclination to do good.
Well, if you want to talk about the dogmatic theological question, that's different than what does the synopsis. I'm going to resist being drawn into a theological discussion as such. If you want to ask what I think the synopsis says,
Okay, that's fair.
I'll simply leave it at that.
Do we have any questions regarding the Sabbath controversy, moving from one to another?
I do.
Okay.
Barry Gritters from the Protestant Reformed Seminary. Can you clarify, Ray, your statement about Dort's declaration on the Sabbath, whether it was a provisional declaration or whether Dort intended it to be a statement that was legitimate, final, and so forth? I'm not sure I understood what you said about that.
Well, the statement was taken to be, I think that it was a matter of different interpretations. Some took it as the last word. There was a statement that in one of the later sessions that Dort would come back to this in a later, at the next National Synod. The Zeeland delegates did not view it as a final statement. Kuyper, in his post-acta, his edition of the post-acta, records this. But the Zeeland statements saw it as a provisional compromise, not as a final statement. So they probably wanted something much more in line with English Sabbatarianism. That's my understanding. So, does that clarify it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Other question?
Yeah, I'm sorry to follow up with a second question, but these topics are very, very interesting. And on the Sabbath, the question I have is clearly the Continental and the Puritan theologians saw themselves as having a biblical view of the Sabbath. But to what extent do you feel that their exegesis and their deductions were affected by contextual circumstances? For example, the Puritans were definitely facing King James' Book of Sports. And there was a Puritan at that time who said that took a position that to ring the church bell on Sunday once more than necessary is as great a sin as to kill a man. And then I think about in the Netherlands, how, after iconoclasm and so forth was finished, but yet we retained many of our high holy days. And eventually the organ and crosses won out. So to what extent was do you feel that the contextual circumstances affected the exegesis of the continental and Puritan views?
I think certainly some of those social and sociological factors played a big role, but I don't know that I'm competent enough to talk about them. I do know that Keith Springer talked about in his article about English and Dutch Sabbatarianism, he talked about how, especially for the refugee churches in the Netherlands, so the English who fled, the nonconformists who fled to the Netherlands, that the Sabbath was an essential, central part of their identity as Englishmen. And I think possibly one of the reasons why they moved on from Leiden eventually and moved to the New World was that perhaps that identity was under threat because the Dutch didn't want to go along with that in general. There were, of course, the representatives of the Nader Reformatie who did, but they seemed to run up against a lot of resistance from the Dutch churches. And I think on the Dutch side, I imagine I just get the sense from a few comments, a little like that comment that Coxeus makes, that some people saw this as a kind of a foreign imposition on the Dutch. And who do these Brits think that they are? Do they think that they are the greatest divines in the world, as Davenant said? Where's Lynch? Is he in there? Yeah. Isn't that what he said?
Yeah.
The greatest divines on the planet, we English people. Right. Right. So I think there was some of those sociological factors definitely play a part.
Anybody want to get to the marrow of a controversy about the nature of the disputations? Sure.
Dolf de Velde. What strikes me is that William Ames did his disputations at exactly the same time as the disputation cycle of the Synopsis was running. So my question is there any indication that these were perceived as competing cycles? Was Ames a sort of competitor of the official faculty? And in connection to that, are there any indications that there was a discussion about his Ramist approach to theology at that time in Leiden? Where did he get his Ramism from, and was there an explicit choice with the other professors not to follow a Ramist scheme?
Yeah. I don't see any competition. Disputation cycles were common in universities. So what Ames was doing was a public disputation cycle. He starts it, a month after he arrives. I guess he thought, may as well jump right back in. He had done preparatory work already at Leiden, so he does this disputation cycle, which is shorter than the 3 or 4 year one at Leiden that produced the Synopsis. So I don't see any competition there. The question of his Ramism, especially at Franeker, you do have a distinct tug of war between the Ramists who are on the faculty, not only of theology, but in the arts faculty. Ames and several others, were distinct Ramists, and there were, on the other hand, Verhel, for example, very Aristotelian in their philosophy. So you had that tug of war at Franeker. At Leiden, I don't recall immediately that extent. I know you have Ramist-oriented people at Leiden in the arts department at certain points, but it is more sort of typically Aristotelian in its focus at Leiden.
Dr. Sinnema, just a quick question or comment. In the 1623 edition, you noted that there were 26 chapters in the second book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you noted in the Harvard edition that the final 4 chapters were lighted. Is that a coincidence that the number actually is 22 like it was in the 1627 edition?
No, it's just that the Harvard copy, for some reason, the last 38 pages got torn off.
Okay.
Unfortunately, so we don't have a complete edition. You know, for a very famous work like this, it's very unusual that you don't have one copy in the world of the complete first edition. It may turn up from somebody's library, personal library, but I've checked very thoroughly in North America, and I've had people in Europe look for copies in continental Europe. There is no copy in continental Europe, and only that quarter of a copy in Oxford. So it's just a matter of the fact that the Harvard copy is missing those last pages. It's an interesting coincidence.
Yeah.
Well, let's thank our speakers once again, and if you have